On September 1st, 1939, columns of German troops crossed into Poland on the orders of Adolf Hitler. The invasion was swift, mechanical, overwhelming. Within days, Europe understood that something far larger than a border dispute had begun. What followed would engulf continents, redraw maps, and end in a reckoning no one in Berlin could yet imagine, because even as victory parades echoed through the Reich, the seeds of its destruction were already sown. For 6 years, Germany expanded across Europe with startling speed. Armies marched through capitals, flags changed. Entire nations fell under occupation, but war is a machine that consumes its own makers. By 1945, the thunder that had once rolled outward was coming back, louder, heavier, unstoppable. Allied bombers roared across German skies in relentless waves. Night after night, cities became targets. Hamburg burned, Dresden was consumed in firestorms. Cologne's cathedral stood scarred amid seas of rubble. When Allied ground forces finally pushed across Germany's borders in 1945, they did not find functioning cities. They found skeletal streets, shattered rail lines, collapsed factories, and civilians wandering through ash like ghosts of a fallen empire. And yet, even in those final months, surrender was forbidden. Hitler's strict no retreat, no surrender orders ensured that fighting continued long after defeat was inevitable. Young boys and elderly men were handed weapons. Towns already broken by bombs were flattened further in futile last stands. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours, and as Soviet forces tightened their grip around Berlin, a terrible question loomed over the capital. Would it be destroyed completely before anyone dared to admit the war was lost? Berlin in April 1945 was a vision of apocalypse. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Buildings collapsed into underground stations where civilians hid in darkness. Water, electricity, and food were scarce. The once grand capital of the Third Reich became a maze of smoke, debris, and fear. Millions were homeless across Germany. With much of the male population dead, wounded, or captured, women and children bore the crushing burden of survival. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler faced the inevitable. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. Days later, on May 8, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The Nazi Party regime collapsed into dust. The banners were lowered. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. But as soldiers laid down their arms, another reality emerged. Surrender did not mean relief. It meant occupation, it meant accountability. And it meant that the future of Germany would no longer be decided by Germans. Across the nation, hunger spread. Rail systems were in ruins, industry was crippled. Entire generations were missing. The moral devastation matched the physical destruction. News of concentration camps and systematic extermination stunned the world and forced ordinary Germans to confront truths many claimed not to know. The question was no longer whether Germany had lost. The question was what Germany would now become. And as the smoke slowly cleared over Berlin's broken skyline, a new chapter began, not of rebuilding, not yet, but of judgment. If you're finding this deep dive into history compelling, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more people discover thoughtful, in-depth storytelling like this, and allows us to continue bringing history to life. Because what followed Germany's collapse would change international law forever and place the defeated nation on trial before the world. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Europe did not exhale in relief. It inhaled in disbelief. Across the continent, millions of displaced people wandered through shattered landscapes. Among them were hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers, marched into vast prisoner-of-war camps stretching from France to the Soviet Union. Many believed they would return home within months. Some would wait more than a decade, and some would never return at all, because the war's final chapter was not about victory, but accountability. In the Soviet Union especially, captivity was harsh and prolonged. Former Wehrmacht soldiers were transported deep into labor camps. In the West, conditions were different but uncertain. Germany, meanwhile, had ceased to function as a sovereign state. It was now administered by the victorious Allies. But even as food shortages and homelessness consumed the civilian population, investigators began assembling a case unlike anything in modern history. Teams of Allied officers, lawyers, and intelligence agents combed through documents, interrogated witnesses, and toured liberated concentration camps. Mountains of evidence were gathered. Film reels, signed orders, eyewitness testimony. What they uncovered revealed a machinery of persecution and extermination that stunned even hardened soldiers. The world demanded justice, but how does one prosecute a regime responsible for crimes so vast they defied language? The answer took shape in the city of Nuremberg, once a symbolic heart of Nazi pageantry. There, between 1945 and 1946, an international tribunal convened to try the surviving leadership of the fallen regime. Among the accused stood Hermann Göring, once Hitler's powerful deputy, and Albert Speer, the Reich's chief architect and armaments minister. They were charged not only with war crimes, but with crimes against humanity, a legal concept that was still being defined as the trial unfolded. And as prosecutors presented film footage of concentration camps to the courtroom, a haunting question echoed across the globe: would justice truly be served, or would history repeat its silence? The Nuremberg Trials were unprecedented. For the first time, political and military leaders were personally held accountable before an international court. The defense argued obedience to orders. The prosecution argued moral responsibility beyond command chains. Testimony revealed deliberate planning, systemic brutality, and calculated genocide. Survivors' accounts left the courtroom in stunned quiet. Verdicts were delivered in October 1946. Several defendants received death sentences. Others were given life imprisonment. A few were acquitted. Göring, sentenced to hang, died by suicide the night before his execution. The message, however, was unmistakable. Aggressive war and crimes against humanity would no longer be shielded by rank or office. Germany was not only defeated militarily, it was judged morally. Its former leaders stood condemned before the world. But justice in a courtroom could not rebuild cities or reconcile divided societies. Ordinary Germans now faced a reckoning of their own. Denazification programs sought to remove former party members from positions of power, yet the sheer scale of involvement made total purification impossible. Teachers, engineers, civil servants, millions had joined the Nazi Party at some point. Where did guilt end and survival begin? As legal proceedings concluded, the machinery of occupation tightened its grip. Germany remained carved into zones controlled by foreign powers. Reparations were extracted. Factories dismantled. Coal shipments redirected. What had begun as punishment risked becoming something else, something geopolitical. Because while judges read verdicts in Nuremberg, diplomats were already redrawing the future of Europe behind closed doors. Cooperation among the Allies was fraying. Suspicion deepened, ideological fault lines widened, and in those fractures, a new conflict was forming, one that would not be fought with blitzkrieg and bombers, but with walls, watchtowers, and divided cities. Germany had been defeated, it had been judged. But it was about to be divided. In February 1945, before Germany had even surrendered, three men met in a Crimean resort to decide its fate. At the Yalta Conference, leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union negotiated the post-war order of Europe. Germany, they agreed, would not remain whole, not yet. It would be divided into occupation zones, disarmed, and stripped of its war-making capacity. What seemed like a temporary administrative measure would soon harden into something far more permanent and far more dangerous. When the war ended, Germany's territory was carved into four zones. The Soviet Union controlled the east. The United States took the south. Britain governed the northwest. France administered the southwest. Even Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was partitioned into four sectors. On paper, it was a shared responsibility. In reality, it was the beginning of a geopolitical fault line that would split Europe for decades. The defeated nation was compelled to pay reparations. Industrial machinery was dismantled and transported east. Coal shipments were redirected. Patents, scientific research, and technological innovations were seized. The goal was clear: reduce Germany to its pre-war industrial capacity. A nation once driven by heavy industry and military production was now deliberately restrained. But as the months passed, differences in ideology shaped each zone's recovery in dramatically different ways. In the Soviet-controlled East, land reforms redistributed property, political opposition was suppressed. In the Western zones, economic stabilization and democratic institutions began to take root under Allied supervision. What had begun as a unified occupation slowly evolved into two contrasting systems, one socialist and centrally controlled, the other aligned with Western capitalism. And as tension between the former wartime allies intensified, Berlin became the epicenter of confrontation, a city balanced precariously between two worlds, where a single miscalculation could ignite a global crisis. By the late 1940s, the Cold War had begun. The Western zones merged economically, laying the groundwork for what would become the Federal Republic of Germany. In response, the Soviet zone consolidated into the German Democratic Republic. Two states now stood where one had existed. Families found themselves separated by administrative lines that increasingly resembled borders. Yet Berlin remained uniquely vulnerable, though physically located inside East Germany. Its western sectors represented a visible outpost of Western influence. Over time, East Germans voted with their feet. By 1961, nearly 1,000 people a day, many of them skilled professionals, engineers, doctors, and students, were fleeing east to west through Berlin. The drain threatened the viability of the eastern state itself. And as the numbers climbed, pressure mounted inside the leadership in East Berlin and Moscow, because if the exodus continued, the system might collapse from within. Then, in the early hours of August 13, 1961, barbed wire appeared across streets and rail lines. Soldiers sealed crossings, families were cut off overnight. Within days, concrete slabs replaced wire, guard towers rose. The barrier grew taller, stronger, deadlier. The German Democratic Republic had acted decisively. The structure would become known around the world as the Berlin Wall. It did not merely divide a city. It divided a people. Homes stood on one side, workplaces on the other, windows facing west were bricked shut. Escape attempts were met with armed patrols and orders to shoot. The wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War, concrete proof that ideological conflict had reshaped geography itself. Germany was no longer just defeated, it was fractured politically, economically, emotionally. If this journey through one of history's most dramatic transformations is resonating with you, consider liking the video and subscribing. It allows more viewers to discover thoughtful, deeply researched storytelling and helps us continue exploring the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Because division would not remain static over the next decades, both sides of Germany would arm themselves once more, not against each other directly, but as frontline states in a global standoff that threatened nuclear annihilation. And as watchtowers cast long shadows across barbed wire and concrete, a question lingered in the cold Berlin air. Would this division last forever? When the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, it did not mark the end of Germany's transformation, it marked the beginning of a frozen confrontation. Concrete barriers stretched for miles, reinforced with guard towers, floodlights, trenches, and patrol dogs. The border between East and West Germany hardened into one of the most militarized frontiers in the world. And as soldiers stood watch over barbed wire and no man's land, an unsettling irony emerged. The nation that had been stripped of military power in 1945 was now rearmed, divided, but armed once more. In the East, the German Democratic Republic established the National People's Army. Thousands of former German soldiers who had endured years in Soviet captivity were recruited into its ranks. Border troops were tasked with preventing citizens from fleeing west. Their orders were clear. The wall was not simply a barrier, it was a line that could not be crossed. For those who tried, the consequences were often fatal. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany formed the Bundeswehr. Former Wehrmacht officers were integrated into a new military aligned with NATO. West Germany became a crucial ally in the Western Bloc, positioned at the very edge of the Iron Curtain. Weapons left over from the Second World War were repurposed. New arsenals were built. Germany, once the aggressor, now stood as a frontline buffer between two superpowers locked in ideological rivalry. For decades, two German states faced each other across concrete and wire. Families communicated through letters. Some waved across checkpoints during supervised visits. Others never saw each other again. The contrast deepened. West Germany experienced rapid economic growth, rebuilding cities into modern centers of commerce and industry. East Germany developed under Soviet influence, its political system tightly controlled, its citizens monitored. The wall did more than divide territory, it shaped identities. And as generations grew up knowing only separation, many began to wonder whether unity had become nothing more than a memory. Yet history rarely remains static. By the late 1980s, change was stirring across Eastern Europe. Economic strain, political dissatisfaction, and shifting policies in Moscow weakened the rigid structures that had held the Eastern Bloc together. Protests began quietly in East German cities. Citizens demanded reforms. They demanded freedom of movement. They demanded answers. In 1989, momentum became unstoppable. Demonstrations swelled. Pressure mounted inside the East German government. Then on November 9th, amid confusion and miscommunication at a press conference, an announcement suggested that travel restrictions would be lifted immediately. Crowds surged toward border crossings. Guards, uncertain and overwhelmed, hesitated and then opened the gates. People climbed the wall. They embraced strangers. They chipped away at concrete with hammers and bare hands. The symbol of division that had defined a generation crumbled before television cameras broadcasting to the world. The Berlin Wall fell not in an explosion of violence, but in a wave of human determination. Germany's reunification followed in 1990. The two states merged into one sovereign nation. The process was complex, costly, and deeply emotional. Economies had to be integrated, laws harmonized, infrastructure rebuilt. But the psychological barrier, the idea that division was permanent, had been shattered. From total collapse in 1945 to moral reckoning in Nuremberg to Cold War division and militarized borders, Germany had traveled an extraordinary path. A nation once synonymous with destruction rebuilt itself into a democratic, economically powerful state at the heart of Europe. Its story after World War II is not one of simple redemption. It is a story of collapse, judgment, division, endurance, and transformation. The ruins of 1945 became the foundation of something new. And in the shadows of history's darkest chapters, a country found its way back, not to what it had been, but to what it chose to become.